By many accounts, the best Super Bowl ad in 2017 belonged to Honda. So how did they do it? Let's start by explaining how normal 3D animation works. The very first talking digital character goes back to the early 1970s at the University of Utah. Park created a 3D mesh, and by moving the vertices of the mesh, he could change the shape of the face and even make it look like it was talking. Now, instead of showing a wireframe mesh, Park computed a color for each of the vertices of the mesh. Vertices on the face would have a skin color, the eyebrows would be darker, the teeth would be white, and so on. 45 years later, a lot has changed, but we still move the vertices of the polygon meshes the same way, but nowadays we specify the color of the mesh using something called a texture map, which is basically just an image file. Every vertex on Lily's mesh has a corresponding point on Lily's texture map. You will notice that Lily's face is stretched out in the texture map. That's because we're trying to map the points of a curved 3D object onto a flat 2D surface. It's impossible to do that without some distortion. Map makers have been familiar with this problem for hundreds of years. Here's a map of the world using the Mercator projection. There are huge distortions at the top and the bottom. Greenland, for example, is actually much smaller than Australia, but you wouldn't know that looking at the map. So what would happen if you just took a picture from space and created a map from that? This would be called a planar projection, and our map would just look like a picture of the globe. There are still distortions because the countries on the edges of the Earth would appear smaller than those at the front, but we could still use it as a map. The same is true for 3D characters. Here's a planar projection of Lily. You can see how the polygons at the edge of her face get very small and even overlap, but you could still create UV texture coordinates from a planar projection. So we could use any photo, even a yearbook photo, as our texture map. All we need to do is get a 3D mesh that looks like the person in the photo, position the 3D mesh, then do a planar projection to generate the UV coordinates for the 3D mesh. This is exactly how Lily's Talkr app works. You move and scale the 3D mesh until it lines up with the picture, and then we use the picture to texture the mesh. When we move the mesh, it looks like the picture's talking.